Hello guys and welcome to my channel. Здравейте господа и добре дошли в моя канал. I just said the things in Bulgarian and in English, but today we have very special guest, probably the most important person in the field of natural bodybuilding, research and all of that. But I will just stop talking and let Eric Helms to present himself a little bit for those of you who were living under rock and don't know who he is. Eric?
Stanislav, thank you so much for having me on the channel. And yeah, my name is Eric Helms. I am one of the co-founders of 3D Muscle Journey, where we have a mission of supporting the lifting community with sustainable long-term approaches to build careers. So of course that involves promoting drug-free bodybuilding. That involves, an evidence-based approach and also a holistic approach, thinking about not just the best way to get ripped and shredded and huge, but also to make sure that we have a good relationship with our bodies, our relationship with nutrition, etc. And I'm also a science communicator and an actual scientist. So I am a research fellow in both strength and conditioning and also sports physiology and nutrition at the Sports Performance Research Institute New Zealand, which is out here in New Zealand where I live, even though I'm originally from America. And that's at the Auckland University of Technology. So I have the privilege of getting to mentor master's and PhD students and help people, carry the torch forward and create more useful research to hopefully guide that mission of 3DMJ. I'm also an author, a research reviewer, and spend too much time on Instagram. So that's pretty much me. And of course, and most importantly, I am myself a natural bodybuilder, powerlifter, weightlifter, and anything that involves resistance training. I try to do it, and typically not very well.
Eric, in the moment that you start responding, I was like, man, probably I should not ask that. You're probably tired of repeating that resume. I mean, it takes like 2 minutes.
Well, hey, you got to feed the ego, man. So I'm now we got that out of the way, and now I can go back to being, humble and answering questions that are not about me. So it's all good.
Yeah, no, but that's important because all of us are lifting weights. People that watch this channel, myself, I've been lifting for 25 years. But from these guys, I think you are somebody like that. That probably 25 years, but we're talking about without rest weeks, without all of this training with the injuries here and around it, that type of guy. And I believe most of the people that watch my channel are that kind of people. They're younger. But anyhow, I don't want to mention anything about me. But here is the first question for a little bit unexpected. What's the best thing that happened to you today, Eric?
Today, or to date, like up until this point in my life, would you say?
Today, just from this morning to about now.
So I got breakfast this morning with my wife, Barbara, and we ran into an old friend of ours from weightlifting back in 2015, someone who's part of our weightlifting club. Completely unexpected. I actually thought that she was out of the country. So we had a good morning catching up with her. And I think that's pretty cool. It always reminds me that probably the best part of lifting weights is not the gains you make, but the people you meet and the relationships that come out of it. So that was really cool. An unexpected, breakfast meetup with someone I hadn't seen in half a decade. So that was a great way to start the day.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. It was alternative, just instead of asking you, how are you? Something I just decided to do it a little bit differently.
I like it.
How do you deal with the current situation in regards to training? I mean, I don't know what is the situation in New Zealand. As far as I know, you guys manage the situation very well, but just briefly with your training your clients.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're very fortunate. We're arguably one of the best places in the world to be in during COVID. So we had an initial lockdown. I was in Costa Rica at a fitness retreat with Dr. Ben House, who does a great job with that. This would have been early March. It's before everything blew up and before it was a bad idea to travel. It was just maybe a questionable idea at the time. So while I was there, it got announced that we were going to close our borders, and if you came back, you'd have to self-isolate. So I knew upon returning that I'd have to self-isolate for 2 weeks. after 1 week of self-isolation that we went into a full countrywide lockdown that ended up lasting another 7 weeks. So for 8 weeks, I had to train not in a gym. Gyms were closed. And I was able to secure a barbell and about 90 kilograms of weight and a couple adjustable dumbbells up to around 24 kilos. So I had to do like body weight, bodybuilding stuff with dumbbells. And then I got really focused on my snatch. And that lasted 8 weeks. And then we came out of it and we had 102 days of no community transmission of COVID. And then we had another, I think, 3 or 4 week lockdown in August. So I think the lesson that I learned from the first lockdown that was longer for 8 weeks was that having flexibility and having the kind of a core mission statement of like why you train, what you care about, and having multiple goals was really important. So obviously I couldn't go do, Atlas stone training like I wanted to because I was going to compete in the strongman comp. Obviously I couldn't do heavy deadlifts. Obviously I couldn't do heavy squats. I didn't even have a squat rack. I couldn't bench. So one of the benefits of being kind of a like general strength training enthusiast, where I like anything competitive lifting weights, was that I got to think, okay, I've got 90 kilograms of weight and an Alico bar. So maybe I should work on my snatch, So
professional setup.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So I was able to, look at the tools I had and build something around that. So I kind of had like this body weight, lightweight bodybuilding and Olympic weightlifting focused training, which really kept me sane during those 8 weeks. And I don't want to overemphasize that too much because there's some people who it's been like five months without a gym in certain parts of the world. So I don't want to make it sound easy or, hey, just be creative and switch your focus. But I think
just be creative and find a Alico bar with 90 kilograms.
Yeah, easy. Just if you don't have an Alico, yeah, I borrowed it, by the way. I don't own an Alico bar, but I think you have to think about the reality of your situation. The lockdown has been really good for people to step away from thinking about what's optimal all the time. As a scientist, I'm always looking for, what's better than, is X better than Y? Or, what's this thing that can give us a 2% edge? And now is not the time to think like that. Now is the time to make the best of a bad situation. And it's going to be challenging for a lot of people because it can become monotonous. It can become boring. So I think shifting your mindset to what's the best I can do given the current constraints of my life is where you'd start. And that might be training less frequently, focusing a little more on maintenance, or changing your goals to let's see how many handstand push-ups I can get. Or maybe you take up running, something that is not restricted.
Running, it's one of the hidden questions I have for you.
I love it. So I guess the short answer is having some fun with your training within the constraints you have and making the best of the bad situation is probably all you can do. And if you're able to stick with it, it's going to really deepen your relationship with the iron so that when you do come back to the gym, you'll be very appreciative of it. And you know that nothing can stop you from lifting if you make it through COVID. So,
man, I love your attitude towards the lifting and that type of old school brotherhood mentality. In the old magazines was always the authors was always writing like that. It wasn't like today, it's just pretty much what's popular, what's famous. Just a side note, in Bulgaria, they just locked it down for the second time. And people are just, I don't know if it's proper to say devastated, but they even start to ask the government to take fitness like business from the first need, something like that. So it can, because, makes sense, if you're healthier, even if it's not. I actually researched a little bit, if actually it's protective to train and to rely on that. And it turns out that, yeah, it might, but if the virus gets you, it just gets you. But anyhow, I really want to start building muscles, Eric. So this was the warm-up questions. When it comes to training for natural bodybuilders, and the goal is to be, as you like to say, lean as humanly possible with the most muscle mass possible, how important is the macronutrient structure of the diet?
Good question. It's important to a point, but it's certainly not the most important thing. So, if I was to get more nitpicky with the way I've created the muscle and strength pyramid, which for reference, it's a hierarchy of importance related to nutrition and training. So on the nutrition pyramid, the bottom layer is energy balance, which means that, hey, if you want to be gaining weight, you need to be taking in sufficient energy. If you want to be losing weight, you need to be restricting energy. And that, of course, is going to dictate whether or not you have sufficient resources to build muscle optimally. And it's also going to dictate whether or not you're providing the right environment for losing fat long term. The next step up, though, is macronutrients. If I was to try to refine it even more, I would probably say energy balance, protein, and then carbs and fat. The reason being is that when you look at all of the research that's out there, which again, it's important to remember that research is about broad populations. It's not going to tell you, dear listener, what you need to do today. It will tell us what's ideal for everyone. And the one macronutrient that does seem to make a difference is protein. You can look at meta-analyses, systematic reviews, and large sample size randomized controlled trials, and you'll see that generally changing the proportion of carbohydrates to fats has a moderate to small to negligible effect at most, depending on what we're looking at, whether that's fat loss or muscle gain. And so long as you're not on the extremes on either end, like an extremely low carb diet or an extremely low fat diet, it's probably not going to be a game changer. But if you look at trials on very low protein diets versus higher protein diets, you will consistently see either neutral to positive effects of taking in a higher protein diet. And when we look at meta-analytic data, which is like a study of all the studies, this is confirmed. So we know it's not just an isolated effect of a few studies. So in general, your macronutrient balance does matter, more so in the off season of just saying, hey, total calorie intake is important. Don't have really low fat or carb diet, and then make sure you're getting in sufficient protein. What is sufficient protein? Right around 1.6 kilograms per kg of 1.6 grams per kilogram of protein per day as a minimum. That's probably kind of the low end I would go, and you could bring that all the way up to around a gram per pound, which is about 2.2 grams per kg of protein. And that's kind of the upper end of the confidence range we have for where you're probably going to get all the benefits from even eating a high protein diet. There may be instances where you want to eat a little more. That may help you, eat a little bit less in the off season if you're someone who's not tracking and you want to benefit from that satiety. If you are dieting and, like you said, trying to get as lean as humanly possible, then I would recommend a slightly higher protein intake because you're going to be using more protein for fuel. So you probably want to replace that from your diet. You want to try to get as much satiety out of your diet as possible. So when someone is dieting, I probably recommend hanging towards the upper end of that and kind of setting maybe 2.2. Yeah, exactly. And also at that point, when you're dieting, you want to make sure that you preserve sufficient carbohydrate and you preserve sufficient fat. So you end up when you're dieting having to have at least one of your macronutrients be lower than you'd like, whether that's carbohydrate, whether that's fat, just because you're calorie restricted. So you end up keeping your protein sufficiently high and maybe a little higher than normal. And then to make sure that you're actually getting really, really, really lean, at least at some point, whether that's 3 months or 4 months into your diet to get on stage, you're going to find that your fats are lower than recommendations or your carbs are lower than recommendations, or you're doing a whole lot of cardio. So there's no ideal way to get shredded because it's not what your body wants to be. So you want to make sure your carbs don't get too low, your fats don't get too low. And some of the bare recommendations I say is, hey, get in at least 1 gram per kg of carbohydrate, at least 0.5 grams per kg of fat. And that's like the bare minimum. And as far as cardio, I typically recommend doing no more than half the time you spend weight training as cardio. And those are kind of like my rock bottom rules of thumb. Like, for example, if we have a bodybuilder we're prepping through 3DMJ and any of the coaches want to go below that, we'll often bring that up and say, hey, am I missing something, guys? Like, do you think there's another way we could get there? Because I'm skirting the lower ends of probably what we want to do, at least for the long term. But it's not uncommon at all to be taking in 0.5 grams per kg of fat for say 3 or 4 weeks during a period where we're trying to get that last bit of fat off before then we start bringing calories up and eating up into the show, just as an example.
Mm-hmm. I specifically ask you this question because I've read this in the literature, in the research, and everywhere, but it's something that contradicts my personal experience with it. In 2015, I competed in the World Natural Bodybuilding Federation as a novice, a little bit older, but novice. I'm just a good strategist. Why to compete with the young guys when I can just beat the novice? And you have to be smart, But I hired a bodybuilder that was IFBB Pro. Unfortunately, the man died. Matt Porter was his name. And up to this point, I was training for 20 years. And the first thing that he gave me was almost 400 grams of protein. This is how I started. And with the maniac kind of mind that I had of 7 meals, I kind of go through it. But then when I start reading more and more about it, the only thing that I found was, I think, Jose Antonio with some research on the topic. And then I start all kinds of diets in regards to this macronutrient structure. We talk about 16-hour fasting with macronutrients breakdown evenly spread. Then 24, let's say all of it. I tried it all for a few years, and including, I think it's important to mention, ultimate diet, Lyle McDonald's diet.
UD2.
And the problem is, and I have photos, I can show you the photos, on the same weight. The conditioning is not even close. On everything less than this crazy protein amount, I'm just not staying like that, man. And I wonder, that's why I crafted the question for macronutrient structure, because I think it just logically makes sense. If you have all the proteins, obviously, so the carbohydrates will vary between 130 at the bottom, 85 at the bottom the last week, and this is short diet, 11 weeks. And I started from 222. But I think, so the satiety was there, I wasn't hungry at all. Actually, I was sick from eating all of that food. And on the week 2 or 3, just the composition just dramatic. I never looked like that. So do you think, like a second question to the previous is, do you think that we just don't try enough with the macronutrient structure in terms of bodybuilders competing and protein in this type of structures? Because everybody that I see in Bulgaria, and believe me, they follow muscle and strength pyramid, we know everything about what's going on in the world. As far as I can see many, except few of the black guys that compete, that have that much muscle mass and that type of conditioning, except your colleague, Mr. Nunes. That I know he did this crazy shred, and I follow specifically his protein. What's our thoughts on that? Is it the specific components? Or?
There's a couple things to consider. The beauty of anecdotes is that they are really interesting about what is possible, but they don't necessarily tell us what is causing something. And the cool thing about them is that you can find the opposite anecdotes in many, many places as well. So I'm interested in the history of bodybuilding, and I've seen in person. I've been to shows since 2005. I've gone to a handful of shows every year, and I think probably at this point I've probably been to over 50 or 60 shows. And I've been to WBF Worlds a couple times, I think 3 times. And I've talked to a ton of athletes, and I've worked with over 100 people who brought them to the stage. And I've talked with a ton of other coaches. So the idea that bodybuilders haven't tried high protein diets, I think doesn't really match kind of the my experience or what the literature would show. Like when you poll bodybuilders and how much they eat, and if you talk to them, I've talked to numerous natural bodybuilders who've consumed 2 grams per pound, 4.4 grams per kg of protein on a day-to-day basis, or at least some point in their career. I did early on for a long time. And I remember I was competing in 2007 on, 300 grams of protein was around my intake, 275 to 300. And then this last season, I was on closer to, 200 to 230, somewhere in there. So I've been, I had a swing of about 100 grams in the last 11 years. And I've had athletes, I remember I used to recommend much higher protein intakes. I would have my clients around 3 grams per kg or 1.5 grams per pound, which is like 3.3 grams per kg, I think. And now I'm probably, closer to 2.2 to 2.6, somewhere in there for most of my athletes during prep. And we've seen eras where people consumed a lot more protein, say in the mid 2000s, to a little bit less, but not much of a change now. An example, Jeff Alberts has decreased his protein over time, and now he takes in typically like 1 gram per pound of his eventual stage weight. So he's dieting, and he's like 190 pounds, or around say 80, the high 80s, and he'll get down to like the mid to high 70s, and he'll be on maybe 180 grams of protein. And he used to diet on higher protein, and now he looks better now on low protein. I look better now on well, I shouldn't say low, on lower protein. And I've had numerous athletes who were taking in around 400, reduce their protein, and they look better. Now the thing is if I present it like that, I reduce their protein and now they look better, your brain will think I'm saying lower protein is better, but there's a million other things going on. The human brain is something of a pattern recognition machine. So if you were focused on your toothpaste and something changed in your life, you would think, I wonder if that was because I switched to Colgate, from teeth whitening toothbrush. So a lot of the times what we're seeing could be the product of numerous other changes. It may or may not be related to the protein intake. When you shift your protein down from 400, that means that your carbs or fat needs to be higher. So was it the fact that your protein was really high, or is it now the fact that your carbs or fat are higher? You might have dieted for 11 weeks. Did you diet the same number of weeks? Did you start from a different body composition? Was your training the same? How much cardio did you do? So I think it's really important. I think you've done the right thing of experimenting. And if you have found that a high protein diet works really well for you, that's great. But in the last, say, 15 years, we've seen the conditioning standard in natural bodybuilding go from maybe one person in the male bodybuilding division in an amateur show having striated glutes to now at a big show, when I go to them, the top 5 all have striated glutes. We're talking a big show, because some of the moderate size shows aren't even 5 people.
I know you appreciate that metrics a lot.
I mean, that is basically that's one of the markers of saying, hey, this person has.
I know.
Gotten.
I was listening in podcast, and you emphasize that for the last diet. I don't see it in more simple way. I mean,
yeah, you got to have lines in your butt, my folks. So, yeah, I think the people have gotten leaner in the last 15 years of natural bodybuilding since I've been involved. The standard is much higher, yet on average, I would guess, and I think this is probably backed up if we did a survey, that the protein intake has gone down slightly. So at the population level, we can at least say that having a really high protein intake is not the key to getting shredded. It is probably an element of it, and certainly might be important for some people. But I think most bodybuilders have experimented with pretty high protein intakes. Most that I've talked to, what they haven't done is experiment with lower protein intakes. I think there's a lot of fear there. When everyone is suggesting, like when the low protein recommendations would be like Menno Henselman, who might recommend like 0.8 grams per pound or like 1.8 grams per kg. That's considered a high protein intake in the literature or in the general population or in the world. So when your community's quote unquote low protein intake is actually what we would objectively consider a high protein intake, and that's the lowest you've ever gone, you never actually tried a low protein diet. It's people on really high, very high, or high protein diets. And I don't know that there's going to be a big difference between most of those for most people. So I would encourage people to try various intakes. Like for Jeff Alberts, he noticed that the more he took from protein and gave to his carbohydrates, the leaner and better his physique looked and the more muscle he maintained, to a point. He did notice if I go too low, that can be problematic. So but the take home.
Sorry to interrupt you here, but
yeah.
Don't you think all the examples we're talking about, it's the guys that already have the body built? So maybe this is also the variable that we have to take, because I'm the same with my protein now. It's lower, even I can eat 3 times a day, but I'm kind of not maintaining even, but I'm not conscious. I just do my workout and everything, and I just eat healthy but without recommendation, and I'm doing it intentionally. Because when I will start dieting for whatever reason, I want to start fresh, and I think with all the examples we talk, it's one thing it's in common, and they are already built it, like you, like Jeff, yeah.
So I mean, you could make the hypothesis that higher protein intakes are more important when you're a novice. However, that doesn't match the data. If anything, we found in our meta-analysis in 2018, led by Morton, that high protein intakes became a little more important. And I don't think this is necessarily something mechanistic. They seem to have a larger effect on resistance-trained individuals. So if you think about it, when you're a novice, it is the easiest time in your career to build muscle. Your body is using your protein very efficiently, and it has a large capacity to grow muscle. So I think if there was an effect, and here's another important thing to remember, like in the hierarchy of evidence, we have anecdotes and observations, which there's a broad range of. There's someone who just says, hey, N of 1, this is me, this is what I noticed, did I meticulously track my nutrition or anything? No. Then you have, a coach who's maybe worked with a couple hundred people, and they have taken notes, and they know the grams of protein their client ate on a Thursday in September 2016 or whatever. That's kind of the highest quality anecdote, and they've looked at this consistent relationship and maybe even run stats on their observations. And then above that, we have like observational data, then we have controlled trials, and then we have systematic reviews and meta-analyses of these controlled trials. And above the anecdotal level, there is no data to suggest that people who are novices do better with a higher protein intake than being at a later stage. So I can't think of any mechanistic reason necessarily why that would be true. You could maybe make the argument that, when you have more muscle mass to build, you can build it at a faster rate. So therefore you should take in more. And I have seen the recommendation in the literature, hey, when you're very first novice building muscle, take in more protein. But the amount they're talking about is, like less than 0.5 grams per kg more than they would normally. Mm-hmm. So, I think it's important for people to realize that protein intake is the material, but the stimulus comes from weight training. If you had someone who was taking in the RDA of protein, 1 gram per kg, and they were training hard and as a novice, they would still make great gains, and so protein actually has a very small impact. The effect size is typically small to moderate at best. And that's why we actually needed a meta-analysis to tell us that protein was, what the protein intake that was ideal. If you were to take 100 protein studies, I would probably guess that around 70 of them would show no difference between the high or the low protein group in terms of the outcomes. No significant difference, I should say. And maybe 30 of them or 29 of them would show a favoring the high protein group. And then there'd be one false negative showing the lower protein group actually did better. So this is one of those times where it's difficult until you actually have a sufficiently large sample size to see the effect of protein, because protein in the grand scheme of things has a small impact. Things like resistance training and eating a sufficient amount of calories are going to have a much larger impact on the total amount of muscle you grow or retain when you're looking at everything broadly. So I think even having your protein perfectly dialed in is typically going to have a small impact for most people. And it's important. When I say most people, I do mean most people, not everyone. If someone has observed, like yourself, that on a very high protein diet, you get better results, my recommendation is to do that because your personal observations take precedence over the research. It's important. Remember that research, the purpose of it is to tell us where to start. And then from there, the experimentation game that may take 10, 15 years begins. So the reason I have decreased my protein from around 300 to around 200 is because I didn't notice any benefit. And I have a better physique and I'm stronger now than when I had a higher protein intake. Probably just because I've been lifting for now another 15 years.
Exactly.
So
experiencing new muscles simultaneously.
Exactly. So I think it's just important for everyone to never put research on such a high priority that it goes above their own personal observations.
And this,
we aren't a study. We're an individual. We're one data point. Is always a good reminder.
It's just like an addition to this. In this case, how can we formulate the question? What in this case the science it doesn't tell us? I mean, what? Because obviously, with all the sample size, I'm thinking it more broadly. Not so specifically by Q, but I imagine all these reviews and tests have margin of error with collating the data. Even if it doesn't, I mean, most of the specific researches are done between 20, 30 people, especially the bodybuilding ones are not with very large group of people. So the margin of error, it will be sufficient. So yeah, and even I formulate questions like that. When is the time that you specifically trust your intuition, kind of, because what I'm sharing is my observation and intuition, over the science, when probably science didn't catch up with what you observed?
Great question. Yeah, so I think first it's important that we understand what intuition is. And there is actually some good behavioral psychologists who have researched this and looked at the limits of it and where it's good and where it is not. So intuition is simply the collection of our experiences and the things we've observed, and then the relationships that we draw from them, our pattern recognition. So someone who's defined as a quote unquote expert is someone who has a lot of experience in an area and can draw upon those experiences to sometimes make connections that they can't readily explain immediately because they've seen this pattern happen so many times. So there is really cool research on firefighters, like fire commanders, that they know when to pull their people out of a building and then it collapses a little bit later. And if you ask them, what did you specifically see that made you have that decision? They can't articulate it very well. They might have to think about it because it needed to happen quickly. And that's, if you think about it, that's the biology of being, in a species that's survived, millions of years. And that has, evolutionary roots to the beginning of mammals, right? If, a prey animal or a predator, of any type, had to slowly think about something and make a decision, they wouldn't survive, right? So we have these intuitive processes that go on in our subconscious that help us make decisions. Now, that's a fire commander dealing with a real situation on the ground where cause and effect are a little closer together, right? However, if you were to look at stock traders and financial advisors, they actually don't do any better than chance in their decisions, and sometimes they do worse. But they've convinced themselves and many of their clients that they do, and they've done research on this, applying random kind of models, looking at some of the stock market trends and stock market analysts, and they're mostly not distinguishable. Yet it's crazy, right? And that's because this is the cause and effect. There is so many variables in a line, right? And I think it's important to remember that nutrition, training, natural bodybuilding, all this stuff is somewhere between those two, right? Some things are very obvious, like I wasn't losing weight, I cut calories, and then I started to lose weight. It was probably because I cut calories. But let's say I didn't change my calorie intake. I'm deep in the off season. I'm at 15% body fat, and I increase my carbohydrates 50 grams. I dropped my my fat 15 grams, and I went on a new training program, and I started taking creatine. And someone says, I think it was this variable. You don't know that, or like I was doing cable rows, and now I'm doing single arm lat pull downs. There's people. This is an example of when we tend to focus on one variable that we're thinking about and forgetting all the other things that might be impacting it. So science is useful because it can isolate variables. But in most situations, science doesn't provide an answer. Like we don't have the cable row versus lat pull down study. We don't have the 50 grams of carbs higher, but 15 grams of fat lower study. So for the most part, the role of science is to give us guiding principles, big picture things. And it kind of tells us how to get in the ballpark. What science does is it disconfirms hypotheses. It tells us what's probably not true rather than giving us answers. So when people look to scientific research to tell them exactly what to do, that's almost the opposite of the way science is built. Science is built to help us understand whether or not a hypothesis has been torn down or not. So if we put forth a hypothesis, hey, energy balance seems to be what dictates changes in body mass, you can challenge that, like the insulin-based hypothesis. That, you know what, if you take a high-carb diet, but you're in a calorie deficit, you'll gain weight. That hasn't worked. So, okay, energy balance, we're still going to stick with that, right? And that's kind of the way we move through things. Like, oh, here's a hypothesis. We think muscle damage causes hypertrophy. Well, it doesn't seem to. Like if we just induce muscle damage without much progressive tension overload, like if we just do downhill running, you get muscle damage, but no hypertrophy. Okay, so we got to remove muscle damage as directly causational. Maybe it's additive or it's related to certain aspects of signaling at a certain point in training. So our hypotheses have to mold based on, or have to change and be molded based on the data that comes out of it. So that system is too slow, and it's not even designed to tell you what you should do on Tuesday. The beauty of science, though, is that the scientific method of trying to isolate one variable, make one change, and then observe what happens is something that you can do in your training on a day-to-day basis. So the philosophy that underpins quantitative research is something you can use even when the actual research itself doesn't give you ideas. So for example, if you wanted to find out whether or not you did better on a higher or lower carb diet in the off season, you could have the same calorie intake, the same training program, the same supplements that you're taking, and go through a 2-month period of being at 40% of your calories from fat and lower protein, and then another 2-month period where you did 20% of your calories from fat, and lower carbohydrate, and then 20% of your calories from fat and higher carbohydrate, and then repeat that twice to make sure it wasn't just a random effect of something else. And if both times you saw you did better on either 20 or 40% of calories from fat and higher or lower carbohydrate, then you can be very sure that for you, that's a better diet to go with. But I think most people don't have that patience. Most people are going to see some article or some Instagram ad or something like that, and they're going to program hop or do something else. Yeah. So I think, go ahead.
It will be also the age. So if you do it when you're 35 and now I'm 40, and I really notice, changes in the speed of the metabolism. Not that it stopped, but it's just not as before. At the same time, I'm not doing now 400 grams of protein. I'm not doing cardio every day. So maybe I'm also getting lazy at the same time. You never know. But from what you are saying, with the same approach twice in the row, so you can kind of...
Yeah, Stanislav, actually, if you don't mind, I want to go back to, you mentioned measurement error. Mm-hmm. and some of the things with science. This is the reason why it's a problem to have a very small sample size in a study. So there's what's called inter-individual differences, so between individuals, and there's intra-individual changes within the same person. Mm-hmm. And what you suggested there, when I'm 35 and when I'm 40, I'm still the same person, but actually like almost all your cells in your body have changed. You're actually not the same person. I mean, you are, but if we were to get someone into a lab and test their testosterone within three times, 3 weeks in a row at the same time in the morning, that would be their normal variation in testosterone, for example. Okay, and it might vary, I don't know, 100 nanograms per milliliter. Let's make up a number there, right? Then if we were to sample 100 men, there would be a range probably from 200 to 900, right? So now we have a plus or minus like 400 range with a mean of around, like 500, right? So now we've got this range from 200 and 900 between individuals, but each one of those individuals has a plus or minus 100 if we'd measured them on a different day, right? Then there's also the question, how much of that is biological variability and how much of that is the actual measurement itself having an error? And that's why it's so important to have large samples.
It's so many just factors. It's just, and the more you know how to ask questions about it, it multiply itself. Like, I mean, exactly with the stock market. By the way, just a side note for muscle. Do you know, for sure you know, but do you know who is Ray Dalio?
I've heard the name, but I don't know him personally.
I will like you to see it. I mean, I don't know how to see it better, but the principles is the free app on your iPhone. If you have iPhone or whatever phone, it's free. He's writing extensively history of the markets and pretty much what we are talking about, but he is talking about these death cycles that repeat itself and why the stockbrokers actually cannot beat the market. But yeah, just side note because you mentioned it.
Interesting. Yeah. So that's why a meta-analysis as an example is so important, because once you start dealing with very large numbers, you can increase the signal to the noise ratio. So, but you can only extrapolate those findings to the population. So the whole basis of most of modern science is what's called null hypothesis testing, which, like I said, is you're testing whether or not the null could be true, right? So when you see P equals less than 0.05, that's saying, hey, if we have an appropriate sample, there's less than a 5% chance that these findings occurred due to random variability. So that key piece of if I have a large enough sample size. So in that modern meta-analysis where we're dealing with hundreds of people taken from multiple studies, and now we can say, hey, there's a break point right around 1.6 grams per kg of protein. We stop seeing that dose-response relationship with gains in muscle mass and protein. We can say, hey, therefore, we'll take the upper half of that confidence limit as a practical recommendation, 1.6 to 2.2, and that's a good place to start. But if we look at one of those hundreds of people, they might have been someone who responded the opposite way. So anytime we look at a study, let's say we have a study where we had 1.8 grams per kg of protein versus 1.0, and that study found 1 kilogram more of muscle mass gained in 12 weeks, and it was a significant difference. If we looked at the individual plots, they'd be like this, which means someone here, for those who are looking on the camera, this person here, this is the person who gained the most muscle mass in the 1.8. This is the person who gained the least in the 1 gram per kg. Yeah, that makes sense. But what about these two people, right? That means this person here gained more muscle mass on less protein than this person here. So you can absolutely see those people in real life where they seem to respond the opposite way that the group did. Now that means that maybe they would have done even better on higher protein. Maybe not. You don't know. But there's so many other variables at play that when we deal with population-based outcomes, we can only extrapolate those findings to the population. So we're not talking about what is best for the individual. This just gives us, hey, you have a higher probability, if we know nothing else about you, to start with a higher protein intake than a lower protein intake, and that you'll do better. But over time, you may find as an individual that you actually respond differently than the group, within reason. Like, we're still all humans. So I think it's important. That's another thing that marks an expert, is they understand the physiological underpinnings of their field. Like, I wouldn't have someone disregard energy balance, because I understand that's a hypothesis that has not been disconfirmed for the entire existence of my field. So I know that that's something that applies to everybody. But I also understand that some people might do better on a lower versus a higher protein diet. If maybe they're just very, very carb sensitive, and they do better with higher carbohydrate intake, and they get a lot out of a very little amount of protein, for example. So they're out there, and I think that's something that everyone needs to understand.
Mm-hmm. I would like to ask you now. Thank you for talking about that. I will just to complete the topic in that sense. I will show you, if you do research again on the high protein, I will just show you the photos, but trying to remove the science context, just like a friend to friend, like Eric, here is my photos, 400, 200, just to see it, and you will see it's like night and day, even, yeah. Okay, so now there is a topic in the fitness field, in bodybuilding. I was also, when I started bodybuilding, this is 1994. So in 1994, I'm a kid and there is no internet, and I'm in Bulgaria, and the only place that you can go and find more about muscles is the library. So there is old Russian books and they will be named something like bodybuilding for everyone, like terrible photos, this with the dumbbells. And some old Bulgarian, I would say masters, but they were just fit people from the beach, but nothing like even natural bodybuilders now. You know what I'm talking about, this type of people. And they will be the first that I will see talking about, and the last talking about running as a form of cardio for bodybuilders. And I want to specify the questions: natural bodybuilders and running, but nothing like a marathon running, just normal jogging 3 times a week, 15 to 25, 30 minutes. Why do you think, and how you feel, why nobody's talking about it anymore? Do you think it's so detrimental, or just is an old stigma that the bodybuilders have with that?
Good question. Yeah, so I'm somewhat of an amateur historian of bodybuilding. It's something I really do enjoy, and I've looked at a lot of pictures and read a lot about the training and nutrition paradigms from the late 1800s in what was called the vaudeville era of physical culture, all the way up into the emergence of bodybuilding in the early 1900s, and it becoming more and more structured, and eventually in the 1950s and 1960s becoming similar to what we know today, especially as Weider took prominence and it started to become separate from strength sport. And the earlier phases, it was called physical culture. And physical culture was people, it basically defines people very seriously interested in weight training and fitness as we know it today in general, as a way of life and a way of making the body and mind and spirit, sometimes depending on who you're talking to, stronger. And it was definitely became more and more dominated by weight training, but all types of fitness were part of it. So if you were to find a bodybuilder in the early 1900s, they would almost certainly be doing things like calisthenics, flexibility training, gymnastics type movements, hand balancing, and they would probably also be in great cardiovascular shape. Many of them played team sports. Many of them were swimmers. Many of them ran. And it wasn't uncommon at all. And no one was worried about the idea that somehow, their cardiovascular or more aerobically dominated exercise would make their body worse. They were much more holistically minded. And there were some very incredible physiques of people who trained for 1 rep max strength, who also did runs and did all kinds of things. And you would see much more variety back then as well. So you kind of had the camp who was all about eating like your steaks and whole milk and lots of food and bulking. And then you'd have people like, Bernard McFadden, who was on a vegetarian diet and did intermittent fasting. And he was one of the first bodybuilding promoters in the United States. So you could find people with incredibly lean and muscular physiques in the early 1900s who were on very little protein, on very high protein, and who were running, doing single 1 rep maxes, or training mostly with body weight. So I think in the modern times, where we have the benefit of the internet. We can have this collective sharing of information, but it also tends to sometimes become amplified. So an example of this is this running or cardiophobic mentality that is in both the bodybuilding and strength training communities. And it's basically a half-truth. So data has come out since the 80s, into the 90s and into the 2000s, that endurance training can compete with some of the adaptations of resistance training. And this is what's called the interference effect. There was a meta-analysis in 2011 which did a pretty good job of actually quantifying this. And they said, hey, there's a few factors which can interfere with resistance training adaptations. And this meta-analysis discussed power adaptations. So that is being more explosive, like if you wanted to throw a shot put as far as you could, and lab measures of your power production. There is strength, like 1 repetition maximum measurements and isokinetic dynamometry maximum torque or force output. And then there's also hypertrophy, such as raw measures of lean body mass or muscle in a lab. And then they looked at, okay, so we have those outcomes. And now we're going to look at different dosages of cardiovascular training. So that all the studies that went in there, whether they were on cycling, or whether they were on running or other modalities. And they found that the longer you did cardio for, and the more the frequency was, the more it would have an interference effect. Additionally, they found that things like cycling seem to have less of an impact than running. Now, if we think about what cycling is, if we understand the concentric and eccentric in weight training. So the concentric is the lifting phase, the eccentric is the lowering phase. The eccentric phase tends to cause a little more damage because of the actual mechanics at the muscular level of what's going on during a lowering phase. It's like force absorption and control under high forces. So when you're running, the eccentric phase is basically once you land and control yourself into being ready to take the next step. Right. The concentric is when you propel yourself off the ground. That doesn't exist in cycling. It's almost all concentric because you're always just pushing down because you're on a mechanism, you're on a bicycle. So there's also no impact. So running has both impact and eccentric forces that are pretty high and scale to body weight. Cycling pretty much takes out the eccentric and there's no impact. So it is not surprising that cycling has less of an interference effect. Also, there were much larger effects on power than there were on hypertrophy. In fact, the effects basically went in this order. Interference affects power the most, strength a little bit less, and then hypertrophy the least amount. So the idea that any and all cardio destroys gains is a bastardization of our understanding of the interference effect. The final thing I will say about the interference effect is that science is often trying to find a mechanism or show a relationship. So that means that many of the studies are designed to elicit the interference effect. So that means you might have someone doing multiple long distance, high intensity runs on the same days immediately prior to doing hard resistance training. And if I told you I want you to go run 3 miles, then do a 5x5 on squats 3 days per week, of course that's a bad idea. But if I told you I want you to go cycling or running or swimming for 30 minutes on your off days from training, you could expect almost no effect. So that's kind of the message, is that the interference effect is real, but it's much more of a problem for power, and it's much more of a problem when it's in close proximity to the actual resistance training. And this makes sense. If you remember back to your beginnings of exercise physiology, if you've ever read about muscle fiber types, the main differences between type 1 fibers and type 2 fibers, and then to a lesser degree, type 2A versus type 2X fibers, is the speed of contraction and their metabolism, what energy sources they use, and how fatigable they are. So the muscle fiber characteristics you need to be a very good endurance athlete kind of directly compete with the muscle fiber characteristics you need to be a power athlete. But the actual force production isn't that different when you scale it to the same cross-sectional area, which is probably why power is more affected than strength, because power really does come down to the actual shortening velocity of a sarcomere, which is going to be affected by the fiber type characteristics, while force production, which is independent of the velocity component, it's much more. You can have force on an isometric, right? that's going to be less affected. And then finally, hypertrophy is just the size of all that, regardless of if it's type 1, type 2X, or type 2A. So that's why it scales. And there's many ways that if you enjoy running, or if let's say you need to do a lot of cardio during prep, then you can minimize the effects. So they kind of go in this order. One is just keep the volume and the intensity under control. You're only going to get an endurance adaptation if you're pushing yourself a specific adaptation to impose demands, right? If you're not lifting, close enough to failure or doing enough volume, you're not going to get bigger. Same thing is true of endurance training. If you're not running long enough or hard enough, you're not going to get better at running. So if you're not eliciting an endurance adaptation, that adaptation can't interfere with your resistance training adaptation. So it's important to remember that almost all of the research on the interference effect is on true endurance training, not, walking on an incline on the treadmill for 30 minutes while you watch ESPN, or walking your dog, or taking the stairs. Like, if what you're worried about is not eliciting an endurance adaptation, there can't be an interference effect. So what most bodybuilders do for cardio, for contest prep, is not endurance training. It's just calorie burning. That said, some people, they do like to go on a run, feel, break a sweat, challenge themselves, and, beat their previous time, or time spent running, or complete the same distance in a shorter time period. So if you're inducing progressive training into cardio, that's okay. Now we know, okay, we could get an endurance effect, but how do we minimize that effect? Well, we know that doing endurance training to the point where it's actually challenging right before resistance training can acutely impact your performance. So that's probably not a good idea. Mm-hmm. Doing it immediately afterward, if you had to choose, would probably be better. But that can still have some of those mechanistic, muscle fiber characteristic, what's called molecular mechanisms of interference. Mm-hmm. You can mitigate that by separating it throughout the day. So you still want it to be after. So if someone's like, look, I want to run every day, I was like, okay, well, how about you resistance train around noon, and then, before dinner, you go on a run. Then we've separated those by around, 4 to 6 hours. That will probably have a much lesser effect than if you're doing it beforehand, and a slightly better effect than if you did it immediately afterwards. If someone doesn't want to run every day, then I'd say, hey, just do it on your off days. So it's kind of the order of things is, if instead of doing it before, try to do it after. Better, try to do it 4 to 6 hours later. Even better, try to do it on separate days. And then you can kind of mitigate all those interference effects. But above all of that is just reduce the volume. So that's why I give that, earlier in the conversation, I brought up that I generally recommend only doing half as much cardiovascular training as you do resistance training. So if you train for, let's say, 8 hours a week lifting weights, no more than 4 hours of running. And that's still a lot. If you think
4 hours is, come on, you're gonna prepare for a full marathon, even more.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I asked you this question because, again, anecdotally, not so scientifically proven, but I just remember when I was running 2018, and I saw, you for sure know the Dr. Hatterfield. He recently passed, not recently, but 1-2 years ago, passed away. Mm-hmm. And he was talking about, this is how I come up with the idea to try it, because I always knew for the concurrent interference training and this and that, but few things was important. First of all, it feels great. Second, it gives you great aerobic capacity, which is still valuable thing in the training. And if you train with high reps, now you can create new stimuli for growth, except from just your example 5x5 strength and but most important than all, I think what Hatterfield is talking about this, it can increase your RMR, resting metabolic rate. How do you feel about it? I mean, this is where I'm going with that. If you specifically to burn or this, but just like because it creates new oxidative stress, so it's a bigger demand on top of everything. And if we don't talk about specifically leaning out or anything, can we actually accept to eat 200-400 calories more as a result of this adaptation? And because of that building muscle, because of the more aerobic capacity, which is can be 5-10 reps more on high reps.
Yeah, I like the way you frame that. So I think it's really important for people to remember that the interference effect doesn't make you lose muscle. It makes you gain it slower. So the amount of cardio and running that you have to do to actually lose muscle is a lot. It's mostly like instead of getting gains at 100%, if you do a whole lot of running, you get them at 80%, but you're still gaining. So that's important to remember. So it's not just a scale of bad, it's a scale of not existing at all. And like you're saying, potentially beneficial adaptation. So I would say this, that if you were someone who is sedentary, and all you do is lift weights, you would probably do better with doing some cardio and lifting weights than not doing it. And we have data on health that time spent being sedentary is an independent risk factor for disease and ill health compared to time spent exercising. So it's not like if you lift weights 4 times a week, you're no longer sedentary. If you're sedentary, you don't get to escape. So if you're sedentary and you lift weights, you have one positive health factor, but you also have one negative health factor. This is the reason why every morning I go on a walk. This is a reason why, when I can, if I can walk somewhere or explore somewhere without taking a car or a trolley or a bus on vacation or whatever, I try to stay relatively active. I look at my step count. And it is indeed the case that if you're in such poor cardiovascular shape that high rep training is hard for you to recover from, you might do better by maintaining a higher cardiovascular base so that you can handle that training. In
30 reps and stuff, yeah.
Absolutely. So not everyone trains that way, of course, but one thing I can tell you is that if you've ever been in a high performance sport environment, when you watch endurance athletes who do resistance training to benefit their endurance performance, they are never sucking wind while lifting because they can handle, like ultramarathons and triathlons and things like that. Now, it doesn't take much to be in good enough cardiovascular shape to handle sets of 10 to 20, is what most people are going to be their high end.
You will not even.
But yeah, it doesn't take much, but it's worth the investment, especially if you're generally sedentary. And there is some research out there showing a benefit of doing both training together, especially in novices who are previously sedentary, et cetera. So it's not like all the data leans towards, concurrent training being bad. Some of it, this works pretty well together. And I think you mentioned how some of these anecdotes, you've seen the benefits from it. Here's some more anecdotes for you. Do you think rugby players or American football players are small or can't build muscle? Like they're doing it.
Yeah,
exactly.
And they train up to 5, but they alternated with fartleks and stuff like that just to not be exactly the same because of the adaptations. And even anecdotally, I like how you said, do you want more anecdotes? So now, do you want more?
Yeah.
My legs are actually better looking stage-wise. I have new fibers exactly because what you were explaining, because and I'm running 3 times, sometimes 4 times a week, 20, most of the times is 20 minutes, very good tempo because I get better at it. I mean, I'm actually running and it feels great, I'm flying. And so the legs is one thing. I totally get recomposition like flawlessly without, I say in the beginning, I don't count, I don't do anything. I'm just getting leaner and leaner. My waistline shrink with 5 centimeters. For some reason, it's not exactly the same thinning of the skin though, but my jeans and everything, I just slim down, and at the same time I have more muscles, and I feel it's something related to more oxygen somehow in the blood or the capacity or something with that sort of stuff. And something from the time, you're not parent yet, right?
No. Just I'm a cat parent.
All right, great. But for this example, you're gonna need very heavy cat. But this is what's going on when you lift weights and snatches. And this, Olympic weightlifting is the highest form of literally sinking the nerve system. And it's amazing what it is. Even then, though, if you have a kid, and when you have a kid, if you are just a bodybuilder, just eat and then researching stuff. The moment when you from totally relaxed position lift an object, just to compensate for the oxygen demand is, let's say, taking your kid and climb 18 stairs. It feels like something dangerous. Really, because I know my body so well, you know what I'm talking about. You just, oh wow. When you run, you know, this is no problem. You just have this aerobic power. It's power. It's still power. It's not weakness. You know, I just
Yep.
yeah.
No, I think this is becoming more and more important as the world gets more sedentary. I think maybe in the 60s or 50s, where there was just a lot more activity generally in life. Like there is some cool stats that I was interested in. I was looking at the amount of time that people in developed nations spend doing chores, and it's decreased a huge amount since the early 1900s, and a lot even just from the mid 1950s. I mean, we don't wash our dishes anymore. We don't wash our clothes by hand. You know, grocery shopping is easier. Everything's easier nowadays.
Postmate.
Absolutely. So there's just a whole lot less activity in our general lives. So we may be more and more important to replace that. As far as your questions about resting metabolic rate, energy expenditure, and getting leaner, it is difficult to separate adaptations from the actual activity because, you know, you described 4 days a week doing 20 to 40 minutes, you know, so you've got, you know, basically 1 to 2 hours of additional energy expenditure at a relatively high rate per week. You know, if you're burning, let's say 5 to 7 calories a minute doing that adds up. You know, that alone could be, you know, additional 50 to 100 calories a day. And, you know, if you notice, you know, you drop 5 centimeters on your waist when you start doing running from when you weren't, you're probably going through a transient period when you're in a net calorie deficit and you're seeing that recomposition.
That's why I mentioned it. So I think it's terrible. I mean, nobody in the fitness community is gonna like it, but this is sometimes eating pizzas twice a day in the row at night. And we don't talk about piece of pizza. I'm talking about 14-inch pizza eating by myself. I mean, I'm serious about it. And even then, this is not the whole time. It's just the worst example that happened. Just eating freely, like my son is giving me a cookie, I will not shy away. Oh, no. No, I will actually eat it. And I feel I have more metabolic flexibility, mentioning that I'm 40 now. So it's not in at least intentional deficit. So you know it's more probably like opposite of deficit.
No, yeah, I don't mean a intentional calorie deficit. I think
Yep.
I think I think when someone takes on a large degree of physical activity, and especially if they have even slightly normalized eating habits or a schedule of eating, it's very easy to outpace that calorie intake and then find a new baseline at a slightly leaner body composition. You know, like the whole concept of the obesity epidemic, it's not that our calorie requirements have changed. They haven't. It's that our energy expenditure has gone down and that our habitual intakes have gone up. So there's a number of things that occur when you're more active. We have more satiety regulation. So you tend to notice when you're hungry and when you're full better. And your subconscious regulation of food intake is better, and you're burning more calories from doing this cardio. So I think it's a very normal thing to experience body recomposition when someone starts, you know, adding in cardio. And I think most people, if they started like doing cardio 4 days a week and make it relatively challenging, would probably notice positive benefits and no negatives. You know, 4 days a week, 20 to 30 minutes is not that much. You know, that's that on that meta-analysis I was talking about, I wouldn't even expect you to be able to notice the impacts on hypertrophy, but you would probably notice some leaning up, which I think is it's just a mindset shift for most people when they think of cardio. It's just bad. You have to be doing a lot.
Especially running, and let me tell you something. Running is not easy. Now I'm 90 kilograms, 200 pounds. So my calves are pumped, my thighs. I mean, in the beginning, I feel like literally like I'm running with the iron shoes. Before the adaptation, I felt the changes in the fibers. And now you feel like a sticks more the legs.
Yep, and a lot of that is stiffness adaptations. You know, getting better at force transference. You know, the running economy improves. That's some of the first things that happen. You get better at force absorption and transference through the ankle, knee to hip joint. So there's a lot of cool stuff that happens. I think an important thing to remember, though, is that you can also take this too far. Like I used to run the 400 meters in high school. And so when I first did my contest prep in 07 and did it again in 09, the natural inclination I wanted to do was to do some sprinting, do some, high intensity intervals with, running on the grass or on the track. And in 07, I sprained my hamstring. And then in 09, I actually tore my hamstring. So I needed to remind myself that I wasn't a 160-pound sprinter anymore, that I was a mid-20s bodybuilder. Again, also, my stage weight's like 180 pounds. So at the beginning of prep, I'm also in the low 200s. And I'm also, not eating enough and not recovering very well. So I think it's important to remember that you're not necessarily a trained sprinter. I'm older, untrained, and heavier. So you can't take it too far. I would say err on the side of doing less rather than more. And if you don't like running any more than cycling or swimming or something like that, I would probably use more often a lower impact modality if you are looking to minimize all the potential negatives and get all the potential positives.
Eric, obviously, I mean, the more I talk with you, and I feel this with every podcast that I was watching with you and articles, I mean, you love the topic. And I love it too. I can talk and ask questions, but I don't want to take you more time. I will for sure invite you again to come to this channel. I want to see how it will be perceived in English, but I will try my best to translate it and all of that. But thank you very much for coming. I mean, thank you for Bob, if he's watching this, that he was the main reason how this was even possible. I want to wish you all the best, and maybe we are planning to do something in Bulgaria, World Natural Body Federation wise. Probably we will see each other there. Also, Las Vegas is possible option. The only problem, though, is that we also may compete against each other. So be careful.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Probably be in the same weight class, huh?
So. Yeah, we are exactly 180. But look at this biceps. Can you see it?
Oh man. Yeah, but it's okay. You're gonna run and you're gonna hurt. You're gonna lose all your muscle running. So I'm not even worried about it. Yeah.
But no, the last joke. I will also worry about the shredded butt.
Yes, that's right. I'll bring the cat butt, and that's gonna get me over the edge.
I've heard this question, and with that we'll close from your friend and great podcaster Daniel Lennon from Sigma Nutrition Radio. But if it's one thing that you will say to the specifically Bulgarian population that is watching natural bodybuilding, what it will be the one thing that they can be to stay leaner over the period of the year?
Yeah, I think especially with COVID, it's so much easier to become sedentary. So I would encourage people to take up something that involves them being more active, whether that's going on bike rides, going on walks, God forbid, maybe even doing a little bit of running, something that won't be affected by COVID, as I've seen almost in every single country that allows it. Going outside for exercise is okay, even if only for an hour. And I would encourage people to take maximum advantage of that. We talked a lot about, metabolic adaptations, the energy expenditure, but just to reiterate, your satiety regulation, the how much you habitually eat, how much you habitually want to eat, and when you want to stop eating is directly affected by your activity levels. There's a classic study, and I'll make this brief, on Bengali mill workers. They had the managers, and then they had people who were doing light, moderate, and high activity. In the light, high, and moderate activity groups, there was a linear relationship between food intake and activity, and they all had the same body weight, meaning that once you're at least even what I would consider moderately active, as the low active factory workers, they're still pretty active compared to modern society, you regulate your body quite well because you regulate your hunger quite well. So you will eat an appropriate amount to maintain weight if left to your own devices. However, the managers who are sedentary had the same energy intake as the high activity Bengali mill workers, but had a higher body weight because their satiety was not well regulated. So humans have spent most of their existence being hunter-gatherers, being active and having to move around, having a nomadic lifestyle, and that is our kind of default setting. So if you make your activity levels far less than that, there is some metabolic dysregulation, and we're not able to well regulate our normal eating. So try to get yourself to a modicum of activity. Even though COVID's going on, get outside. It'll make you happier as well. Get out in nature if possible. And that will greatly help you, maintain a healthier body composition and find a more normal homeostasis for you without having to stay restricted or weigh your food all the time or something like that.
Thank you very much, Eric. Hope I'll see you next time.
True pleasure. Thank you for having me on. And I look forward to doing this again.
My pleasure.